It says you're live on media.
Okay, let's try a different approach.
Which unit? PowerPoint here.
Yeah.
This anyway.
Yeah, that's a better way to do it.
Just give me a thumbs up. That's good.
Okay, and you are on
Getting my job.
Java. Okay, I believe I've turned the microphone back on. Murray is getting himself set up on Jabber, and he will watch Jabber and channel anyone who can't talk in MeetEcho, but please use MeetEcho if you can. This is the Dmarc working group. We are meeting in Brussels today, Prague, but Brussels. If you're in Berlin, please come to Brussels. We're in Prague, but we're in Brussels. Yes. So yes, I encourage those of you who are sitting in Berlin to come to Brussels. And let's get started with Dmarc. We have an hour, I believe, and then Dcrup comes in 10 minutes later, and you're all encouraged to stay for that. We have a new note, and this is actually it, referring to the new RFC 8179, which has some changes over the old ones. So if you are not familiar with the new changes in BCP 79, please make yourselves aware of them by looking at the RFC. All I have on the slides beyond that is the agenda. We are running slideless apart from that. Have a look at the agenda, where after this administrative stuff, we'll have a little report from what happened at the hackathon, and then how we're going to handle IETF Mailman to try to mitigate the many unsubscribes. And at this point, I will say, as part of both of those, that from here until we implement the mitigation in IETF Mailman, if you are posting from an address that has a reject policy and your posts cause unsubscribes for other people on the mailing list, I am going to ask you to post from a different address. And if you don't, I am going to block your address from posting. I will repeat that on the mailing list, but that is the policy for now. You are disrupting the mailing list's operation, and that will no longer be tolerated.
Is that for
I don't know. That's what I am doing. We hope in September-ish that we will be implementing a mitigation in Mailman, and then we will no longer have to do that. But in the interim, I'm tired of dealing with the unsubscribes, and it is a disruption to the operation of the working group. So it qualifies for a minor chair action, and that's what will happen. Then we'll talk about open issues with the ARC specs, including discussion of what the document status ought to be. And then we will talk about how to handle enhanced reporting. The subtitle here is what should be reported in a Dmarc report when ARC is involved. Then I put in a thing about deployment discussion. Maybe there's nothing to say about this, but I would like to kick off a little discussion about that. And then we talk about what we do next after the ARC document, which is the Dmarc usage document. And Tim, I believe, is on remotely, and he will lead that. And then I imagine we're going to be out of time, but if not, we'll see if there's anything else to talk about. Does anyone have anything they want to add to, strike from, or change on the agenda? Okay, then we are done with slides. And I better put the agenda back up, because otherwise I won't know what to do here. Let's just leave the agenda up. So, Kurt and/or Steve.
I think I can chase it unless Steve wants to add in from the floor mic. I sent a summary of the hackathon work out to the list, and to recap it without reading the whole note, we had 6 or 8 people. We got a couple of, we got testing done, we got builds done, we got a new forwarder, thanks to Andreas, in place. And the fast mail guys made some good progress on their mail authentication milter in Perl, and we look forward to having that committed soon so that people can download the latest and greatest on that and make use of it. I also had a conversation with John Levine, whom I don't see. Oh, there you are. That I think you're working on some sort of an implementation as well, right? In Perl. So we're going to have a couple new implementations live really soon. And Alexi's working on one of his own, and Chris Newman is working on one for the Oracle messaging suite. So there's quite a lot of progress going on in that regard.
And so I'll say on the hackathon that we will be planning to do another hackathon project before Singapore, right?
If you like, we can plan on that. Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend.
We don't all need to be there for it. We can do hackathon participation remotely.
Sure.
So for those of you who are not aware, the IETF hackathon is held the Saturday and Sunday before the IETF meeting, and is a way to get some coding done related to IETF projects, IETF working group projects. And this was the first time that the Dmarc people participated in the hackathon.
Yeah,
So
we
I'd
can
like to see us
certainly
do that.
sign up and plan for it with IETF 100. Again, I'm going to be on vacation, so I'm not even going to be remote.
So, but Steve will be able to, maybe. All right, we will see. We will see if we can crank up a hackathon project for Singapore. So, if you might have implementations or other work to do related to ARC or Dmarc,
Keep it in mind.
Please let us know on the mailing list, and we can coordinate a hackathon project.
Yeah, sounds good. And even before Singapore, because I believe that's November, we will indubitably have some sort of discussions or presentations at MOG, which will be at the first week of October. For anybody who's interested, please stay tuned on the list, and we can keep you posted on that.
Right.
Moving on, if there's no questions or
Yeah, any other
jabber.
comments about hackathon? Hearing nothing, let's go on to Mailman.
Okay, so Steve and Seth and I met with Henrik and Robert on Tuesday. They were very happy to hear about the progress with ARC and the fact that we had some implementations that would actually work for Mailman 2, which is what is currently being run for the lists. And they were looking for 2 specific things. They were looking for stability regarding the on-the-wire content, which I think that once we come out of the meeting today, we will have achieved, and with one more draft update to get this week's changes in and published. And then the second thing they were looking for is a package for OpenSUSE that they can just install and track as a package that's been installed. Andreas was kind enough to volunteer, and I think that Seth is going to help drive for the packaging. As soon as they have that, then we'll work with them between now and sometime soon to get that implemented, and then we'll have the mailman lists for IETF ARC enabled.
And when is that likely to happen?
What do you think for having a package available, guys? Late August, early September for the people who are remote are the words from the room, and so possibly, yeah, sometime in September we might get that turned on for the IETF lists. And then we've also been working with the MOG Mailman administrator to get the MOG lists, which also run on Mailman 2, ARC enabled, and I think that will probably be a little bit sooner for that. Is that? Yeah. Okay. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, we'll get the MOG lists. So there'll be a first pass production run, and then we'll follow up with OpenSUSE package and get it on the IETF lists.
But I believe we are still planning to implement a Dmarc workaround in the mailing list. Would you say something about that, Alexei?
So Henrik nearly finished his code. He's basically doing packaging of his stuff, and he's taking holidays in August. So the plan is to do experiments in September, starting somewhere early September.
And the mitigation we have chosen is?
From rewriting.
Right.
I mean, we did discuss, we haven't actually officially decided between two strategies of from rewriting versus message wrapping, but the code is written for one of them. And the other one requires mailman update anyway, so.
You guys are you running an old enough version of 2 that you don't already have the Dmarc patches in the from? Because that has been, Dmarc enabling of from rewriting has been in Mailman 2 for quite a long time.
Yeah, I'm not, Henrik is the one who knows what we're running.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Notes from the floor, or comments from the floor says it's a different sort of rewriting that Henrik is working on.
Yeah.
Now, of course, one of the issues we have is as we try to do both of these, that we still need to do the mitigation, because even after we are ARC enabled, the recipients will not be ARC enabled, so
Right.
it won't help. And we'll need to do some interesting experiments with that, of turning the mitigation on and off in order to experiment with implementations on the receiving end.
Yeah, that'll give us some good operational guidance going forward to help
Yes.
people who run similar setups.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Any questions, comments about that? Hearing none, let's get into the ARC specs.
Okay, so I have a half dozen things here. First off, I'll run through a couple of settled issues that we've sorted through in list discussion this week and will be reflected in the next release of the spec. First one is whether or not it's mandatory to sign the ARC authentication results within the ARC message signature, and we have decided no. And I've not seen any objections to that on the list, so I'll consider that settled. The second one is collapsing CV invalid into CV fail. That was done a little while ago, so that we will only have, oh, sorry.
Do you want comments on these? Are you going to run through the list and then go through each of them in detail, or do you want to stop and talk about each one as we go?
Let me do the 4 settled issues first, and then we'll take comments on them.
Thanks.
So the collapsing CV invalid into fail so that we only have a none, fail, and pass was done a couple of weeks ago before the deadline on submitting changes. The last 2 are the ARC or the authorization results, authentication results, ARC equals policy being added to the pass-fail methods. And then the question of how to deal with multiple authentication results headers when you're doing an ARC sealing. I think that we've talked it through and everybody agrees how to do it, and it was just a matter of getting wording put in to consolidate them all into one and stick them into the ARC authentication results header. So questions and feedback.
Although I'm sitting up front pretending this is the MARF working group, I'm just a participant here. So about the not signing of AAR, which I support, but it just occurs to me that we're going to have an installed base, some of which does sign and expect that to be there, and some that does not. Are we concerned about a period of interoperability issues?
No,
Why?
because it's optional. So it's,
Sorry?
you may sign it within the ARC message signature, but
Yeah.
you don't have to. ARC message signature tells you which headers it is signing. And so if you are signing the AAR, then you should be reporting it. Otherwise, you're not going to be validating today.
As
So
long as nothing out there insists that it be signed,
I,
that would be an issue. Sorry.
that, yes, if something is going to fail an ARC message signature because it didn't cover enough headers, but I'm not aware of any of the current implementations that do so.
Okay. I think that was the only one I had.
Okay.
The ARC seal covers it anyway, so.
It does, yes,
Yeah,
that's
but-
correct.
I was addressing a different point, and that is that if what we were saying before is that AMS must cover AAR, and if suddenly something notices that it doesn't, it might complain. So
My question was around temp failure. If
Yes.
you fail to validate because you have DNS issues.
I
What
did
do you-
not
what do
include
you
that
feel?
in the settled issues, so
Yeah.
thank you for raising that. That was another
What do you report
area.
in your seal, SCSCB?
So there was some discussion on the list this week about how to deal with temp/perm error type scenarios with DNS. And it's not as far as consensus yet, but the general theme seems to be that if you cannot resolve a signature because of DNS failures of whatever sort, permanent or non-permanent, that you should either defer the message, so 421, and not accept it and not have to worry about it until it comes back to you. Ultimately, if the temporary failure is of long enough duration that the message is undeliverable because you'll never accept it, then it'll go back to the sender and they'll know that their DNS is broken.
Cool.
And I don't think that there's a value in putting an ARC result in that says, hey, I couldn't figure this out because the DNS wasn't cooperating. Because frankly, if you're passing a message through, let's take a mailman scenario, it will, within milliseconds, if not seconds, pass through your entire infrastructure and be out the back door. If it's a temp fail that's that short, or somebody's got a flaky name server out there, okay, maybe another query would sort it out, maybe it wouldn't, but there's no point in putting an ARC chain said, I don't know, and pass it on.
Yep, thanks.
And the southerner you just heard from, who was not Kurt, is Bron Gondwana. Please say your name when you speak at the microphone. Thank you.
Another open area in the spec is cleaning up some of the language. I am currently working on melding the working draft with Murray's proffered rephrasing of significant sections of it. And so after the meeting, I will be submitting that as the next version of the draft, because Murray's version was quite a bit more succinct in many areas. And I hope that it will be meaningful to people. If people really hate it and prefer mine, then we'll roll it back. That's the lovely thing of Git. And there are some challenges as I've been trying to come up with the wording on how we deal with algorithm evolution. So dealing with the concept of a chain that spans multiple mediators, and some of them want to sign with RSA SHA-256 of whatever key length, and some of them want to sign with an elliptic curve, which isn't approved yet, but we're going to talk about that in the next hour-ish. And how do we make a chain that can successfully survive multiple algorithms, and algorithms in evolution is kind of an interesting challenge, and how to phrase that. So I'm still grappling with that.
this is Murray again, but we don't need to worry about that for version 1, right? Because what's going to
No.
ship will have a complete set. It's when we do some revision in the future that introduces a new algorithm that this will be a problem.
But the challenge is that if we write the ARC spec today, and then DKIM says, well, you could use this, or you could use that, or you could use the next thing, and you should stop using this and move toward this over the next couple of years, etc. So anyway, it's not a blocker for stability of on the wire. It's just something that we're going to have to figure out how you would authenticate a chain that might have a variety of algorithms within it. So the other thing that has come up in talking through in the hackathon is getting better language around conveying trust within a trust boundary. So you typically will receive a message and you'll check its authentication status, including whatever ARC may be on it when it comes into you. And then you do some stuff to it internally. Let's think about the mailman case. And then you want to send it out and put an ARC seal on it at the end that says, when I received it, it was good. I messed it up, and now I'm sending it out. The initial language in the spec wasn't clear on the fact that you have to evaluate chain validity status when it comes in, but then put that on the result when it goes out. Many initial implementations were putting a chain status when it was received and separately computing a chain status when it went out, and they're basically saying, oh, it was good when I came in, and now it's busted, you deal with it. And that's not the right model. So let's see, another thing is we had some discussion this week around signaling whether somebody participates in ARC. So whether they are volunteering, I'm a mediator kind of a thing. And the general consensus was you couldn't trust somebody anyway, so why worry about it? But it does lead to the question of helping small receivers bootstrap their trust store, if you like, of who do they know is going to be a list server or a mediator that can be trusted. And I think the hallway discussions kind of converged on that's not a spec issue. And so we're going to have to help people bootstrap outside of the spec, which is good. And then we've got an open question around the AAR content and format, which we'll cover kind of on my next set of areas with the enhanced reporting. And then the last one is the standards track versus experimental question, which I left for the end. Any questions before we get into the standards versus experimental?
And my question is, what do you see as the time frame that this will be ready for working group last call?
We are now at July 20th. I expect that I will submit a new draft tomorrow morning before I get on an airplane, and would like to see us be able to go to last call by the end of the month if people can respond to that quickly.
So we're looking at roughly a week-ish to
Yes.
get these last issues resolved, modulo the discussion we're about to have.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's ask everybody to be aggressive about responding and getting this sorted out so we can make that schedule. Dave, would you like to state your argument for making this experimental? Where we've got the red button waiting for you. There he is. Here's Dave. Go ahead and mash the button. He is a blue ghost. Dave, you're on.
Hi there, this is working?
Yeah, you're
It's
very quiet.
Is this any better?
It is.
All right. So the suggestion I was making is that this is not a criticism of the draft or the work or the idea or anything like that. This is a feeling that the role of ARC involves dynamics and practices that need some experience. And since this involves infrastructure service, on the average, when one isn't completely clear what the dynamics will be with an infrastructure change, one wants to proceed cautiously. And so my suggestion for how to proceed cautiously is to initially issue this as experimental. And when the industry feels that there is enough experience to write a substantive BCP on how ARC should be used, not based on theory, but based on practice, then the spec would be ready for standards track.
And my concern in response to that is looking at the official IETF descriptions of what it means to be experimental, is that I'm concerned that that might scare people off from, well, it's not worth us implementing because after all, it's just an experiment. And I think that we've put enough work into it and we do have enough implementations already in practice at Google and AOL as the primary largest ones right now, that it's worth moving on the standards track with it.
So, and as chair, I'll throw in some process things. That first of all, we're afraid people won't implement it if it's experimental is not a reason not to make it experimental if experimental is the right status. But the other side of it is that it's not black and white, that it is a judgment issue. If we think that this is ready for us to propose a standard, realizing that it may be changed later, then standards track may be the right thing. But Dave's point about experience before we jump is also a valid one. So let's think about that and go ahead and discuss. So Murray first and then
Okay.
Andreas.
This is Murray. If we want to pursue the kind of aggressive timeline you're talking about, like you're going to have a draft this out a week, we want to do a working group last call by the end of the month, I lean very strongly toward experimental. If we're willing to be a little more patient than that, get a couple more things out, get some experience with other than huge operators, then, and we were to accept something like working group last call, we'll be in IETF last call, let's say, or maybe AD review somewhere, some step in there by Singapore, I would be much more comfortable supporting a standards track.
Interesting. This is Barry. I was expecting you to look for a more protracted schedule. That is part of the trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, I think
saying that we
Singapore would be fine to target Singapore instead of targeting next month, if that would make a difference.
Realize that from the time it leaves the working group, it's still likely to be a couple 3 months before it's an RFC.
Yeah.
So the issue is, one thing we could consider is whether putting out the RFC as soon as possible and making it experimental and then revising it in 6 or 8 months to be standards track is appropriate, or whether saying we're going to make it a stable draft and leave it in draft state for a while to get that feedback and then go to publication requested as standards track. That's another possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that decision can be made based on where we think people will be more likely to implement it and try it out. Andreas.
Andreas Schulze. When I implemented Dmarc 2 years ago to force or reject, I had conversations with numerous people in Germany who are referring, oh, what's Dmarc isn't a standard track, so I won't implement it, so I don't care about it. So not being a standard track is an issue.
I'm in the queue after Chris.
Yeah. Gotcha. Martin Aartsen. So I have a question about small receivers, and it was just mentioned.
Yes.
Do we have any experience about their willingness to implement or their ability to implement given the bootstrap problem that was mentioned earlier?
We have some initial reports that there are some smaller operators that have implemented ARC. I don't know how many, and we did have a training session that was done in Lisbon last month at the MOG meeting, and I think the gentleman behind you in line may be able to comment further. So if you guys want to do a trade thing, and then...
And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Can you please repeat?
Martin Aartsen.
Thank you.
Seth Blank from Bellamel. So we did an ARC training at MOG, and basically to bootstrap the issue, there's basically a list that a bunch of the major receivers and some other report processors put together of the intermediaries that break mailing lists. And it's a pretty well-known group of about 2,000 intermediaries, and that list basically never changes. And so we're really comfortable publishing that list publicly, making it available for use. It's a short-term fix to bootstrap the specific problem. There needs to be a better solution long-term.
Okay.
But because of that, I actually think that Dave has convinced me that experimental makes sense, because this is where we're going to have problems. I think we'll know pretty quickly, and pretty quickly within 3 to 6 months, where the issues come from, if this works, if we're having reputation issues with small receivers. And I think this is an experiment that we need to define but we can move to standards track within a few IETFs if we have sufficient data.
Then I have to question whether it's worth the overhead to publish experimental instead of staying as a stable draft for some period of time, like Murray suggested.
Right. So the decision point there is what we think will be best for implementations. Will we get the implementations we need if we leave it as a draft and announce to the world that it's a stable draft that isn't going to change, but we're just waiting for feedback? If we think that will get us enough implementations to do the experiment, then we're fine.
Mm-hmm.
If we think it needs to be an RFC, even if that's experimental, in order to get the implementations, then we should go the other way.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and
So-
from what I've heard, publishing an RFC, even if it's experimental, I think will get people to implement, and then we can review with data and see where it goes. But that's one person, what I'm hearing.
Right. As an example, the HTTP2 development was done the other way, where they had cuts where they said, this is an implementation draft, and everybody implemented it. But the difference is that all the major players were in the room there,
Right.
and we're all implementing it at that time. We don't have that situation here. So.
I think
And
Dave's
do
trying
you-
to say something.
Oh,
Dave is in the queue after me.
do you, Seth, before you leave, do you have any insight as a report processor about small operators who may have implemented, how many may have implemented and have started reporting on ARC basis?
So not really. I know Brandon's latest email was at the beginning of June, he was seeing 0 people ARC signing to Google, and by the end of June, he was seeing about 200 unique D equals domains
Okay,
ARC
great.
signing.
Okay, I hadn't seen the 200 number, so thanks.
He posted that to the Dmarc list at the end of the month.
Okay.
Chris?
Chris Newman, I reviewed, so I've read the draft and started to work on implementing it. And, the ARC protocol draft, I don't see anything that I suspect is wrong with the technical part of the ARC protocol draft. Now, the reputation model, that's where we have uncertainty, but that's not going to be standards track anyway in the first round of publication. So let's just publish it standards track because, at this point, generally, I think it's experimental if there's something in the spec that I'm not sure is going to work. The protocol spec, there isn't anything I know of that falls in that category.
Right. I don't think anybody's arguing that the spec is technically immature or uncertain. But to put words in Dave's mouth, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, his point is that the effect that ARC is trying to achieve is something we are uncertain about and we need to experiment with.
But the effect is not in the protocol spec.
Okay.
That's the point I would make.
Yes. Okay.
Murray.
This is Murray, and repeating something Jim said in Jabber, we both are agreeing. On the other hand, in contrast to what Andreas said, there are a lot of people who think that any RFC with any status is basically a standard. There was a story posted, I think Seth posted it on a Facebook page this morning, that someone referred to Dmarc as a standard, even though it is purely informational and in fact has no IETF consensus.
Right.
So, right.
Yeah.
And then
Well, yeah,
Dave.
let us not comment on politicians and their technical acumen.
Yeah, and then Dave is next in the queue. So here you go.
So,
Ghost, go.
Dave, you're up.
hi there. So it's entirely possible that the spec is fine as is, but I think there's a chance that that's not true. And the reason is, excuse me, this is a transitive trust mechanism with sequential signing. If people know of any operational, real-time operations mechanisms in use on the internet today that employs that kind of model of sequential signing in transit, I don't know about it. And if there is that operational experience, it would be good to document that. So the concern I have is not that the thinking behind this is wrong, but that we don't know what the operational dynamics will be. Add to that then the fact that the role of this mechanism in the trust for handling email is unique. We do not have any operational experience with this. And as we get that experience, it's possible we will find that the spec needs changing. The signatures might be more fragile than we want in deployed networks. There may be some other problems that make this work less well than we'd like. And the fact of history with transitive trust is not promising. Doesn't mean it won't work now, but it means that we ought to be cautious about it. The fact that there are people out there who don't understand what a standard, an IETF standard is, or the difference between standard and RFC, has been touted as a problem for the entire history of the IETF. The reality is the IETF has some rules for how it does labels. We ought to pay attention to that rather than the fact that there are some people out there that don't understand it.
Dave, do you think that the real-time aspect of this makes it substantially different from, say, key certificates, where we have a
I believe
chain of signing?
I believe certs are typically done statically. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's been my impression.
And how does that make the effect of it different as you see it?
It's a completely different operational environment. The physics of the operation are quite different. And oh, by the way, certs don't work very well.
Ecker.
I'm just finding myself a little confused by the argument Dave's offering. Certainly we have plenty of protocols where digital signatures are performed in real time. That's how like TLS works most of the time at this point.
Yeah, but that's not what I said.
That's not treated.
I didn't say that signing was a problem. I said sequential signing.
Hi, Dave. Hi, Dave. You can let me finish? Thank you. So, as I was saying, we certainly have lots of protocols for signing that in real time. I'm not quite sure why sequential signing is different. I'd certainly be interested in hearing why. So I mean, like, you could certainly say, for instance, that we don't, that when we're rolling out a protocol, we never had a protocol with this exact sequence of bits before, and so we have no experience with that. So I think you do owe a little bit more in terms of why this particular thing is different. I'm certainly open to hear why. I don't have a brief for this particular protocol. I'm just trying to understand the situation. So in what way is sequential signing different from non-sequential signing?
Dave?
That goes to such a fundamental point about networking dynamics that I'm not quite sure how to respond to it. It's a little bit like saying, well, because we've done something once, doing it many times won't be an issue.
So, okay, I just must be exceptionally stupid, which I suppose is quite possible. But I really do think that's not much of an answer.
It wasn't much of a question.
Rich is coming up.
So the view that networking dynamics is trivial because we've done one kind of thing and we're now doing something that is a different dynamic. And forgive me if I think that signing something, doing a series of signatures that depend on each other is a fundamentally different dynamic than doing a single signature. I can't comprehend seeing that as anything other than different. And so I don't know how to explain to you. I mean, in point of fact, this is like trying to prove a negative. I don't know whether this will work well. I can understand that it might, but I also can understand that it might not. We don't have any operational experience with this dynamic.
Rich.
Yeah, hi, Rich Sauls, Akamai. If you do this signing as part of this, somewhere between the store and forward, I don't see how there's any way for it to get out of order. And like Eric, maybe I'm just a little ignorant of, certainly much more ignorant of this spec than I should be. But yeah, it's part of the message processing.
It isn't a question of it getting out of order as much as it is of, will it actually, I think the big question is, will it accomplish fixing the problem that we are intending to have it fix? Is that?
Well, and the point is it's a dependent chain. That
Right,
each signature depends on what came before it.
But so do received headers. So I think it's a wash. I don't think it's an issue.
Bron Gondwana, Fast Mail. So I actually asked a question earlier which goes directly to this point. What happens if you can't do a DNS lookup halfway along the chain? If you're rejecting it from the first sender, fine, you 400 it until it fails. If you're rejecting it halfway down the chain, who's it bouncing back to? That is a question that we do have to think about.
Well, if we're looking at a mediator being a mailing list, then presumably it would be sitting in the outbound queue of the mailing lists processor. If you're looking at somebody doing a more of a .forward type forwarding, again, it would be sitting in their queue. Where does it bounce back to? Well, probably Postmaster, frankly, in most implementations.
If it fails to come out from the mailing list, then it's going to cause a bounce failure and going to cause that person, the receiver, to be removed from the mailing list when the actual fault is the DNS records of the sender, which brings us right back to the issue that we currently have with the Dmarc list, that people who are sending from incorrectly or strictly configured domains are causing other people to be removed from the list, and that would actually be the same failure mode.
Interesting point, yeah.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to let this go on for another 4 minutes, and then we need to move on.
So it occurs to me we do.
Dave, you're up.
It occurs to me we have one operational example of problems with signing, and that is that DKIM is designed in a way which should work just fine from client to client, from the author to the recipient. But operationally, the experience is it doesn't. It works from the originator to the receiver, and generally doesn't survive within the enterprise. That's just one example. It's not the sequential signing that I'm talking about, but it points out the fact that signatures can turn out to be fragile when going through a sequence of handling sites.
Agreed. I'm still, I think that is more of an operational aspect, and it isn't necessarily an indictment of the technical protocol, but
there's no indictment anywhere here. It's just a question of whether we are best served by announcing that this is an experiment that needs some answers before we propose something final.
Right. And I guess I am going to have to defer to the experience of the chairs and our AD as far as how they think this debate should be resolved, because
for right now, I think it's we need more discussion. So I'd like to ask Alexei to have a final comment on this topic. What are your thoughts as someone who has been tasked with leading us?
I'm not sure I formed my opinion as area director. My personal opinion, pick one.
If this issue came up, let's say we went with standards track, and this issue came up in IESG evaluation where the IESG was discussing whether we should experiment with it first. Do you have any thoughts on how that would go? And what you would, where you would lean?
Or do you want to think about it and reply to the list?
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, one question actually that sort of may be related to this is we can ask for operational ops directorate review and DNS people review to see if they see any other things that we haven't thought about yet. So
always worth doing.
Yeah. So we can ask for early review.
I'll just the comment from Tim on Jabber. Operationally, email is vast. It makes sense to me to put out a protocol and ask for feedback in an experimental context.
And this Murray, experiments, if we do decide to go experimental with, there's plenty of reasons to do it that way. We should just be very clear about, how long the experiment's going to run, how will we collect the results, how will we apply them.
Right, and that, to me, that is part of the question as I've been trying to prepare for the meeting here, is that if we called it an experiment, what would be our criteria for decision as to whether that passed or not?
Right, we need to be clear about what results we need to get in order to evaluate.
Okay.
Dave, Dave went away.
Okay.
Okay, I was going to say last comment before we move on, but
If
all right,
you
go
want,
ahead.
He's back.
Wait,
I can ask ISG about, try to describe.
no, not now.
Okay.
Dave, go ahead and mash the button. Dave, final comment.
Sorry, I just wanted to add in response to the criteria for going to standards track. What I proposed, and I'm continuing to think makes sense, is when there's comfort to write a usage document that says this is how you use ARC in operational service, and it describes not just the implementation of the mechanism, but the integration of the mechanism into email operations. When there's comfort with writing a version of that that has substance, then the spec will be stable.
Good final comment. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm going to skip so Kurt, if you want, you can have a seat. Tim's up next. I'm going to skip my deployment discussion. Oh, we still have, oh shoot, I forgot that one. So, all right, can you do that in 5 minutes or
Yes,
less?
I think so.
Okay, so we have enhanced reporting. Go ahead.
Okay, so question around enhanced reporting has come up. And the crux of the issue, as I've been noodling on it and talking in the hallways, is that the authentication results header was initially posited to be feedback to a human consumer. And what we're looking at in the AAR and the Dmarc reporting is feedback to a machine, essentially. Ultimately, it goes back to the operator, but it is mechanically mediated. And so as such, there are a couple of data points that are desired for the initial sender in order to be able to troubleshoot problems in their sending infrastructure. Those are specifically the IP that it came out of and the selector that was employed in initiating the chain. And I think that actually carries through the entire ARC sequence. So every mediator can have the same sort of a problem that occurs, and therefore adding those two pieces of information, the source IP and the selector, into the reporting data set would help people in troubleshooting their sending infrastructures. We would propose to add that in. There is an open question about how that gets formatted into we don't necessarily want to put it into the 7601 authentication results header because, again, that's designed for an individual person to consume as a client receiver of the message. But how we carry it through and get it into the AAR and how that's formatted is open to question. Murray, we're not quite sure if you were joking when you suggested putting it in inline JSON, but a few people have said, hey, that's a really good idea. All right, we're getting rejections from the floor here.
Why?
It'd be the comment could be formatted as inline JSON. Why not? Anyway, okay, so we're going to have some on. We'll take it to the list as far as how we get these things incorporated into the AAR. The other questions are when and where to report with ARC. Every step ought to be reporting back to the sender. That's going to result in multiple reports for a single message, but that's up to the report consumer systems to consume and consolidate, and that probably isn't going to be a problem. Although we're having some people having whiplash here at the front desk. And I think that was the crux of the question around enhanced reporting. So format is really the open question. And then how, if at all, do we change the format and structure of the Dmarc report in order to accommodate ARC and then potentially other extensions. Right now it's largely unformatted as to how those things are specified in the XML, and whether we need to improve that or specify it in some fashion as part of moving Dmarc toward standards track. It's kind of an open question. We can take it up on the list.
Okay, are there any quick comments about what Kurt just went over? Okay.
Seth Blank, Valamel. I think it's important in the current spec before it goes to final call to get in what's transmitted and how. But I think we can actually do the reporting mechanism, sort of the update to Dmarc in a later spec. I don't think we need to necessarily wrap that into this because that feels complicated and potentially just will take some extra time and may need some additional work.
Yeah, I agree. We don't want to burden this one down or bog this one down with getting that done.
Alexei.
So comments about previous discussion about experimental standards track and how it affects our plan. The plan is still, you publish a new document within a week. We still go to working group last call and, well, assuming it's close enough. And as in, this doesn't affect the short-term timeline anyway.
I agree.
If we can do the working group last call with this open question hanging over our head, then that's fine.
Yeah. I think we can. The only thing that it might affect is we might, if we choose to delay publication and leave it as a stable draft, we can decide that after working group last call.
That's fine.
As part of working group last call.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, then Tim. Tim posted a list of things to the mailing list to get the discussion about the usage document going. I don't know how many read it, but Tim, go ahead and start talking.
Sure. I actually have a comment about the past discussion. Item number 5. Am I coming through?
Yes, we can hear you.
You are.
Okay, great. Hey, just about the ARC work and how it affects Dmarc reporting. There was some list traffic that was making arguments about what the contents of ARC should be to enable certain kinds of Dmarc reporting. It's really hard to follow the argument, though, if we don't really know what the desired Dmarc reporting looks like. So it's kind of hard to flip it around and say, hey, we need this without actually talking about what needs to be in a Dmarc report. So I
think we really need to push the rest of this to the list because I want time for the usage document discussion. We only have 8 minutes left.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to say that it's hard to put one thing before the other and follow the arguments if we don't really know what the end goal is. All right. Okay, so the Dmarc usage document. A couple days ago, I posted a summary to the list. This all began with, hey, let's not make a usage guide unless we really need it. The archive, it's from the 17th of July. Feel free to look it up in the archive. It's also been posted to the list. To summarize the state of the work, I think philosophically, the need for a usage guide probably follows a prior discussion in this own forum where a protocol is pushed out, experience is gathered, and then you push for a standards track document. So the way I see it is a usage guide would be important so we could go through, collect operational experience, codify it in some way in the form of a document, and then push it out. And so this argument was pushed to the list and said, and the pushback was, well, if there's something, if there's something new that needs to be shared, then maybe we should look at making a usage guide. So I've gone through and collected the few questions in the summary email, and that's where it is right now. There's a small collection of people that want to contribute to the usage guide, but it's still essentially being bootstrapped. I've tried to facilitate the process by identifying people from different parts of the email ecosystem and getting them to share their experience. There's only been 2 of these kind of interviews so far pushed to the list. I personally find them valuable, but if the rest of the working group does not, and the feeling is that, hey, if after the ARC work is far enough along to move to the next stage of the Dmarc working group's charter, that is working on Dmarc, the technical spec as a standards track document, then it doesn't make sense to tie up the working group with this work. So I'll put it out to the group now. If a usage guide is worth working on, it makes sense to do it now with sort of a focused effort. Otherwise, if there's no real traction within the working group itself, this work could go on somewhere else in a different context. I personally feel that the IETF is set up to do exactly this kind of work, so why not do it in this context?
So let me start. The objection that was raised was that there's there are already a lot of places to look for guidance on using Dmarc. Why should we do another one? Is there anybody who wants to stand up and support that argument and say, no, there's enough of this stuff out there already, we don't need to spend our time on it? Seeing none, I'll ask, hey, Hup. Kurt's up.
Kurt Anderson, you got to give us time to get to the mic. Yeah, I think that there is a considerable set of existing documents and training materials, some of which you can find on dmarc.org, not all of which, but there's also training on the MOG website publicly available around deployment. It doesn't necessarily collect sort of the operator experience stories that I've seen Tim collecting and reporting to the list, but is a set of anecdotal reports from operators really what we're talking about in terms of usage BCP RFC document?
And so you see anything we do as not adding value or not adding enough value to that? Is that what I'm reading?
I think that collecting anecdotal reports and sort of field reports of how people have put Dmarc into place can be valuable, but I'm not sure that that qualifies exactly as a usage document.
No, that's fair.
That's worth publishing as an IETF document. It seems more like something to publish as a series of sort of, here's what we did and here's what we found, anecdotal reports.
Right.
Tim, respond to that?
The interviews that I've been doing and publishing to the list, that's not the final form. I was just trying to get people to start sharing their operational experience. But in response, a response in two parts. One, I think that there are certain parts of the email stream that are underrepresented in terms of documentation and how to interoperate with Dmarc. Basically, email receivers, I don't think there's a lot of support for them personally. If you're a domain owner, there's lots of help, commercially, free, and otherwise, to get Dmarc implemented. But email receivers have very little in the form of resources. The second part would be email service providers that are sending email on behalf of others. The advice and guidance is pretty spread out. So there's an underserved and basically underrepresented parts of the ecosystem that don't have this kind of documentation. The second thing is, I think that the IETF in the form of a BCP document getting published and giving an RFC number is an ideal vehicle to be the source of truth for any kind of usage guidance.
Okay, Jabber, and then Alexei.
Channeling Jim Fenton, given that Dmarc has significant operational issues, which is why ARC exists, shouldn't we be discussing an ARC operational document instead?
Well, instead or in addition or combined? I don't know. Alexei?
Combined.
Just about, if there is, assuming people are interested in working on usage guide type information, we don't necessarily have to publish it as RFC. Right. You know, it's still you, and we can end up with a wiki or something like that. So
right.
RFCs being, you know, stable documents that don't change very often, well, that don't change and that can get out of date, you know, shouldn't be the reason not to do the work. That's
Sure. My view on that in this case is that if the document, if we ultimately want to have the working group make a statement about usage recommendations, I think an RFC is the right place for it. But I was going to go partway in that direction and say, Tim, what do you think about continuing work on this for now and not making the decision and deferring the decision about whether to publish it to later, after the working group gets a chance to see how it develops and what is in it? are you willing to work on it with the idea that it might not be published if the working group decides the content isn't sufficient?
Yes, I don't think the work is going to go anywhere. To me, it's a question of, I'm sorry, I don't think the work is going to stop being worked on. It's just a question of how it gets published.
Okay, then my proposal is that we continue working on it with the idea that it might not wind up as an RFC that the working group publishes, depending on what the content winds up being. Okay, and there are a lot of nods from the room, so that seems good. And that is the end of our time. I'll just ask if anyone in the room or on MeetEcho has any final comments. And Murray, would you red button Tim? Kurt.
Looking at the steps that were set forth in the charter for the group, the goal was ultimately to get Dmarc to standards level. When we complete ARC at whatever state we put it into operation, I know there's been some concern from the chairs that we continue making progress in this group. And what is it that we need to do in order to continue making progress beyond ARC toward getting Dmarc on a standards track?
Seth, did you have a comment, or were you stretching?
I had a comment, but I'll take it to the list.
Seth will take his comment to the list. I'll say, as the chair managing this stuff, and not having any more say than that, my view is that we should not be making Dmarc a standards track document until we have something we can do in Dmarc to actually address the mailing list problem. And I think we really need to spend our time thinking about what we can do to do more than just patch it up with something like ARC, but actually have a mitigation in the Dmarc spec. Maybe that's not realistic, in which case we can rethink it, but let's think along that line. Where can we go in the spec that will make the spec a standards track thing that doesn't damage existing long-term usage on the internet?
Okay.
It's a challenge for us. And Murray has something.
I know that there have been issues identified with Dmarc that we will eventually want to address in a standards track version. Mm-hmm. Would it be appropriate to begin collecting those in the trackers? If you have those, go add them to the tracker.
Yes, we certainly, before we actively start work on a standards track version, we can do the preparatory stuff. And we do have, what?
Jim has something.
Okay, and we do have a wiki to work with on that. Old eyes. Given that Dmarc has significant, this is Jim Fenton, given that Dmarc has significant operational issues, which is why ARC exists, right? Oh, wrong one, sorry. Jim, I'd be interested in seeing a split between the reporting and policy aspects of Dmarc, make them separate documents. Okay, and we are out of time plus 3 minutes. So thanks everybody, and in 7 minutes, decrupt begins. If you have not signed the Dmarc blue sheet, please do, and I'll find it when you're done.
At the opening.
And I'm going to move my water in a moment.
I was going to,
Sorry. Is it only one for 3?
I stacked them.
Oh, okay.
It's a small room.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much.
TLS wiretapping
We'll find another one.
No. What it is a bunch of people from enterprise said we need to be able to TLS 1.3.